In the dark days after Pearl Harbor, America needed hope. 16 bombers, led by one daring man, rose from the sea to strike the heart of Japan. This is the story of courage, revenge, and the moment when the world realized America had only just begun the fight. The night over the Pacific was silent, but the sea below carried whispers of destiny. Far from the shores of America, a colossal shadow moved, an aircraft carrier, slicing through black waters under a starless sky. On its deck, 16 bombers stood ready, engines sleeping, wings spread like predators waiting for the dawn. Every man aboard knew the odds. No one had ever tried to launch such heavy bombers from a carrier before. It was madness, some said. Suicide, others whispered. But after the fire of Pearl Harbor, America needed a message, a strike that would echo across the ocean and reach Tokyo itself. In a dimly lit cabin, Colonel James H. Doolittle studied the maps one last time. His eyes were calm, but inside burned a storm. "We're going to show them," he murmured. Outside, the ocean roared louder, as if it too knew what was coming. No one expected victory. What they wanted was redemption. As dawn crept over the horizon, the men prepared for a journey that would change the war forever. Engines coughed to life, propellers spun, and one by one, the bombers rolled forward, toward a sky filled with uncertainty, courage, and history waiting to be written. The sun rose slowly over the gray Pacific, its first light glinting off the steel decks of the USS Hornet. The sea was calm, but every man aboard felt the storm inside. They had been sailing in silence for days, far beyond the safety of American waters. No music, no laughter, only the hum of engines and the rhythm of the waves. Colonel James H. Doolittle walked along the deck, his eyes scanning the horizon. He was short, sharp, and unshakable. Every step he took carried the weight of a nation's expectations. Behind him, crews checked bombs, tightened fuel caps, and wiped the sweat from their brows. "Sir," a young pilot said, "do you really think we can make it to Japan from here?" Doolittle smiled faintly. "We'll make it there," he said, "and we'll make them remember us." They all knew what this mission meant. It wasn't about destruction, it was about sending a message. America had been hit hard at Pearl Harbor. Ships burned, men died, and pride was shattered. But this was the answer. 16 B-25 bombers, each one ready to carry the fire back across the ocean. In the early morning light, sailors stood in rows, watching those massive aircraft resting on the carrier's narrow deck. They looked impossible, too large to fly from such a small space. But impossible had become their new reality. Below deck, the pilots gathered around a table. The air smelled of oil, salt, and adrenaline. Maps spread open, targets marked: Tokyo, Yokohama, Nagoya, Kobe. The mission was simple in words, impossible in execution. Fly out, drop bombs, then somehow, reach China. Doolittle stood before them. His voice was steady, calm. "Gentlemen," he said, "tomorrow, we strike the heart of Japan. We won't be coming back to this ship. But what we do will echo in every American heart. Remember what they took from us. Remember why we fight." Silence filled the room. No one needed to speak. Each man carried his own reasons: revenge, duty, or the desperate hope that their courage might turn the tide of war. That night, few slept. The ocean whispered against the hull, the stars flickered above, and in the distance, the faint outline of destiny waited. By dawn, the Hornet had reached its point of no return. The sea stretched endlessly around them, blue and merciless. Then came the sound, a lookout's cry from the tower. Enemy patrol boat spotted. Everyone froze. The Japanese had seen them. The element of surprise was gone. Doolittle didn't hesitate. He turned to his officers. "Launch them all, now." Engines roared to life. Propellers screamed. The wind howled across the deck. One by one, the bombers rolled forward, their wheels clattering against steel. As each aircraft reached the edge, it leapt into the sky, barely clearing the waves. Men on deck watched with clenched fists and pounding hearts. The impossible was happening. As the last bomber lifted off, the carrier turned sharply east, away from Japan, away from danger. But the 16 planes flew on, into the rising sun. In that moment, the world shifted. America was no longer on the defensive. The fire had crossed the ocean. The sky was a deep gray as the bombers pressed on, flying low and steady across the endless waves. The Pacific stretched like an iron plain below them, cold and merciless. Hours passed, and fuel gauges sank lower and lower. Still, no one spoke of turning back. In the lead plane, Colonel Doolittle sat silent, hands firm on the controls. The wind tore at the fuselage, the engines groaned, and the ocean below looked like it could swallow them whole. He glanced at his crew, calm faces, steady eyes. They all knew there was no return. Over the radio, a voice cracked through the static. "Tokyo ahead, 30 minutes. The words hung heavy in the cockpit. Every man felt the same pulse of adrenaline, the same burning purpose. Below them, Japan slept. Factories, train stations, homes, all quiet under the morning haze. The enemy thought themselves untouchable. That illusion was about to end. "Prepare to drop," Doolittle ordered. The bomb bay doors opened, wind screaming through the plane. The city of Tokyo emerged below, streets glinting, smokestacks rising, people walking unaware of the sky above them. Came the sound. The first explosion cracked through the morning silence like thunder. Flames burst from a power station near the docks. Seconds later, another explosion tore through a warehouse. Panic spread like fire. Sirens wailed, people ran, and the sky turned red with fury. Japanese anti-aircraft guns opened up, sending black clouds of shrapnel into the air. But the bombers were fast, diving and weaving through the chaos. From above, Doolittle saw the city burning, flashes of orange cutting through the smoke. It was not vengeance, it was a message. One gunner shouted over the roar of the engine, "We hit the refinery." Another cried, "Smoke over Yokohama." Across the sky, 16 planes struck in waves: Tokyo, Yokohama, Kobe, Nagoya. Each target erupted with fire. For the first time, Japan's capital knew what war looked like from above. Down below, Japanese civilians looked up in disbelief. American planes over Tokyo, it was unthinkable. Some shouted in terror, others simply stood frozen. The Emperor's city was no longer safe. Doolittle's crew completed their run and pulled away, engines straining, fuel nearly gone. The mission was complete. No radio celebration, no cheers, only exhaustion and silence. "Head for China," Doolittle ordered. "God help us get there." As the bombers turned west, smoke rose behind them, rising pillars of fire marking their passage. The men didn't look back. They had done what no one thought possible. Hours passed. Fuel dwindled. The ocean disappeared beneath thick clouds, mountains of China faintly visible ahead. But night was falling fast, and rain hammered the cockpits. One by one, the crews realized the truth: they wouldn't make it to their planned landing zones. Some crashed in the mountains, some bailed out over dark forests, some never found again. Doolittle jumped last. The freezing wind ripped at his clothes as he fell into the black night, parachute opening above him like a whisper. He landed hard in a rice field, soaked and shivering, but alive. When he finally stood, he looked back toward the east, toward Japan. In that darkness, miles away, the fires of Tokyo still burned. The mission had succeeded. It had not destroyed Japan's army or navy, but it had shattered something far greater: Japan's illusion of invincibility. Across the ocean, in America, news of the raid spread like wildfire. For the first time since Pearl Harbor, the people smiled again. Hope returned. The world saw that courage could fly farther than fear. Morning light crept over the mountains of China. Mist hung low, the air smelled of wet earth and smoke. Scattered across the countryside were the men who had defied the impossible, Doolittle's raiders. Some were injured, others lost, a few captured. Yet every heart that still beat carried pride, not regret. Colonel Doolittle woke in a small Chinese village. His parachute hung in a tree above him, torn and dirty. Villagers surrounded him with quiet awe, whispering in a language he couldn't understand. One old man handed him a bowl of water. Doolittle bowed slightly, his eyes weary but alive. He had thought the mission a failure. All 16 planes were gone, most destroyed or lost. No base reached, no return to the carrier. "We've failed," he whispered to himself. But miles away, in Tokyo, the truth was burning through the smoke. The Doolittle Raid had shocked Japan to its core. The unthinkable had happened. American bombers had struck the heart of the empire. Panic rippled through the Japanese government. How had enemy planes reached their skies? Where had they come from? Who was responsible? In the imperial palace, military leaders stood silent before Emperor Hirohito. The air was heavy with shame. Admiral Yamamoto, commander of the Japanese Combined Fleet, bowed deeply. "We underestimated them," he said quietly. "They will not stop here." The raid forced Japan to reconsider its strategy. The Imperial Navy demanded to destroy America's carriers, their last symbol of offensive strength. Yamamoto planned a trap, a massive operation to draw the U.S. fleet into battle and crush it once and for all. That plan would lead them straight to Midway, but for now, vengeance came first. In China, Japanese troops began a brutal campaign to find and punish those who had helped the American pilots. Entire villages were destroyed, tens of thousands of civilians killed. The price of heroism was terrible. Yet the Chinese never betrayed Doolittle's men. They hid them, fed them, guided them to safety through mountains and rivers. After weeks of hardship, most of the surviving airmen made it out. When Doolittle finally reached friendly forces, he expected a court-martial. In his mind, the mission was a disaster: planes lost, men missing. But when he returned to America, something extraordinary happened. As he stepped off the transport, the airfield erupted in cheers. Reporters swarmed, flags waved, and soldiers saluted. President Roosevelt himself congratulated him. The Doolittle Raiders became national heroes. For the first time since Pearl Harbor, America felt the spark of victory. The newspapers called it Tokyo's wake-up call. The world called it the impossible raid. And somewhere in the skies above the Pacific, that echo of fire carried on. It would reach Midway, the turning point of the war, just weeks later. Japan had been warned, the United States had only just begun to fight. Far away, Doolittle looked out the window of his transport plane as it crossed the ocean once more. The clouds rolled beneath him like waves of silver. He thought of the men who didn't return, of the faces lost to the storm. He whispered a quiet promise: "Your courage lit the way. We will finish what we started." The engines roared, carrying him toward the horizon. In that vast sky, the story of the Doolittle Raid became more than an act of war. It became a legend of defiance, a symbol of hope born from ashes. Because on that April day in 1942, 16 bombers did more than strike Japan. They reminded the world that freedom, once wounded, always rises again. The Pacific Ocean stretched endless and silent, but deep beneath its calm surface, the war had changed. The Doolittle Raid had pierced the heart of Japan, leaving behind not only fire and smoke, but humiliation. The empire that once believed itself untouchable now burned with anger and pride. In Tokyo, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto studied a map covered in red pins. His officers stood in silence as he moved one pin toward a small speck in the Central Pacific, Midway Atoll. "Here," he said, voice low and sharp. "We will draw them out here. The American carriers must die." The plan was simple in vision, complex in execution. Japan would strike Midway, a lonely island halfway between Asia and America. They would lure the U.S. fleet into a trap, surround it, and destroy it completely. Once the American carriers were gone, Japan would dominate the Pacific forever. But Yamamoto didn't know the Americans were already listening. Intelligence officers at Pearl Harbor had broken parts of Japan's secret code. They knew Midway was the next target. In a small operations room, Admiral Chester Nimitz leaned over a table, studying the same ocean Yamamoto did. "They think they're hunting us," he said quietly, "but they're sailing into our guns." In the weeks that followed, American carriers, Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown, moved into position. The same Hornet that had launched Doolittle's bombers now carried new wings of vengeance. Pilots trained relentlessly, the memory of Pearl Harbor still burning in their minds. June 4, 1942. The battle began. At dawn, Japanese aircraft struck Midway Island with devastating force, but American scouts had already found the enemy fleet. As Japan's carriers prepared to launch a second wave, the sky filled with dots, American dive bombers descending from the sun. The world held its breath. In less than 5 minutes, 3 Japanese carriers, Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu, erupted into fire. Explosions ripped through their decks, sending smoke towers into the sky. Hours later, a 4th carrier, Hiryu, met the same fate. The pride of the Imperial Navy burned on the open sea. From that moment, the course of the Pacific War turned. The empire that had once swept across Asia began to crumble, piece by piece. Back in the United States, the news of victory spread like a sunrise. The Doolittle Raiders, though scattered and scarred, were remembered as the spark that started it all, the strike that forced Japan's fatal gamble at Midway. One night, Doolittle stood alone at an airfield, the wind cutting across the runway. He looked up at the stars and thought of the men who never made it home. He could almost hear their engines echoing through the sky, the faint roar of courage that refused to die. He smiled softly. "We showed them," he whispered. "Not for revenge, but for the promise of freedom." The Doolittle Raid had not just avenged Pearl Harbor, it had awakened a nation. It taught the world that hope could fly on wings of steel, that courage could rise from the ruins, and that even in the darkest nights, a few brave souls could light the fire that would guide millions. As the wind swept across the empty runway, Doolittle turned away and walked into the dawn. The sky above was calm once more, but history would never forget the day 16 planes changed the course of a world at war. Years passed. The guns of war fell silent, and the Pacific, once red with fire, returned to blue. Cities rebuilt, nations healed, and time moved forward, but the memory of those 16 bombers never faded. In quiet corners of America, the Doolittle Raiders lived their lives far from the roar of engines and the smoke of battle. Some became teachers, engineers, farmers. Some carried the scars of war, both visible and unseen. Yet each man knew he had been part of something larger than himself, a moment when courage defied reason. Colonel James H. Doolittle rose through the ranks, promoted to general. He never called himself a hero. When asked about the raid, he simply said, "We just did what needed to be done." But behind his calm words was a lifetime of memory. The faces of the men who didn't return, the sound of the wind over Tokyo, the leap into the dark over China. In Japan, the Doolittle Raid became a painful reminder of vulnerability, but also a turning point. Years after the war, when peace finally came, some of the surviving raiders met with former Japanese officers. There were no speeches, no hatred, only quiet understanding between men who had seen the same hell from opposite skies. Every April, those who survived gathered together. They wore simple jackets with the emblem of their unit, a silver plane flying through flames. They told stories, laughed softly, and raised a toast to the friends who had not made it home. At the center of the table stood a wooden case filled with silver goblets, 80 of them, one for each man who had flown that mission in 1942. Each goblet bore a name engraved twice, once upright, once upside down. Every year, as time claimed another brother, his goblet was turned upside down, never to be raised again. By the 1980s, their numbers grew thin. The voices that once filled the skies now spoke quietly, their strength replaced by memory. Yet even as the years passed, the fire in their eyes never dimmed. In 2013, the last few remaining raiders held their final toast. The world watched as they lifted their goblets one last time. The air was heavy with silence and pride. One of them said softly, "Gentlemen, the mission is complete." They drank, not to victory, but to the bond that had carried them through fear and fire. Colonel Doolittle lived to see the end of the century. When he passed away in 1993, his ashes were laid to rest in Arlington National Cemetery, a resting place for heroes. Above his grave, the wind still whispers like the hum of engines over the Pacific. And every time the world speaks of courage, his name echoes with it. The Doolittle Raid did more than strike Tokyo. It changed the spirit of a nation. It taught that no enemy, no distance, no fear could silence the will of the free. 16 planes flew into a storm of uncertainty. They returned as legends written in the sky. Because courage is not the absence of fear, it is the decision to rise, even when the world says you cannot. And on that April morning in 1942, 16 bombers proved that truth to all mankind. The sky remembers. History remembers. And so does the heart of every soul that still believes in hope.